There we Okay, that's good to know. Recordings in progress. Anyway, and really what this is the history of DX. Oh, hold on a second here. Before before the advent of FT8, right? Things are definitely a lot easier to work DX now than they were back in the very early days of radio, and we're going to talk about just how difficult it was. So the first question I pose you guys is, who were the first DXers? Well, it could be these guys, right? Back long before wireless existed. But yeah, these guys would send messages. And they found out if they went up on top of a mountain top, they could send messages farther than they could if they were down in a valley somewhere. So I thought about this for a while, and I said, well, gee, I wonder who the first person to use what they did for QRO back then. And I figured, well, it must be something like this, right? You get a bigger signal. That's what the Henry amp turned on back in the days of the Wild West. There were examples of early ways to communicate long over distances. In the early days, they had the optical telegraph, and DX was considered then to be basically as far as one could see. Right? If you had this thing up on a hill, it could see over the next hill, and they could send semaphore back and forth and communicate. Then in the period of 1880 to 1903, this disruptive technology began to emerge, known as wireless, right? Starting with James Maxwell and his and Maxwell's equations that prove that radio waves and light waves are essentially the same thing. Heinrich Hertz, who basically validated and proved Maxwell's equations were true, and then Marconi, who was the one that really commercialized the works of the guys ahead of them. Think of their very early DX, how it was in the very early days. In the earliest days, the radio technology was really very primitive, right? This was before the vacuum tube. So most amateur DX was limited to just about 100 miles or so at most. Think of what they were using back then, right? They were spark gap transmitters, sometimes even using a Model T, ignition coil as a transmitter, and then a very crude, galenium rectifier diode in a crystal set, right? No amplification, just as pretty, about as broad as you can possibly get with a transmitter, and a very unselective receiver. So they didn't get very far, maybe a maximum of about 100 miles or so if you had a lot of power. The next disruptive technology to come around really in 1906 was the Audion triode tube, invented by Lee DeForest. And what this did is this enabled radios to have a thing called amplification or gain, right? Crystal radios are passive. People I certainly had a crystal radio. One of my first radio that I built was a crystal radio when I was an early teenager. And the ability to have the vacuum tube really made radio technology viable. And I really, you can almost put DeForest in the same line as those previous gentlemen that I did, because this really was a game changer for radio. The radioactive 1912 came around, and this was really kind of important to think about. The act, among other things, limited amateurs to 200 meters and shorter wavelengths, about a megahertz and a half as higher, as those high frequencies then, as they're considered then, were considered useless by the government. Most of the transmissions were done on roughly 400 meters to 600 meters. Of wavelength, and these high frequencies, nobody was ever going to be able to use anything up there. So why don't we just give it to the amateurs, let them deal with it? The outcome at that time of radioactive 1912 limited amateurs to 1 kilowatt of transformer input power. And if you were unlucky enough to live near a military installation, they could essentially keep you off the air or limit you to just a few hundred watts of power. And it's interesting that power that you had in a spark gap transmitter was very wide. As a matter of fact, in actuality, Clinton DeSoto in 1936 wrote in his book 200 Meters and Down that in actuality, spark transmitters occupied the territory of about 150 meters to 200 meters. In other words, they were pretty darn broad. and that power you had was spread across that entire spectrum. It wasn't concentrated into one narrow band as they are now, or one narrow continuous wave. Technology marches on. In 1914, Edwin Armstrong patented this new technology, regenerative receiver, where we started to get some selectivity in how receivers were had the ability to not only amplify the signal, but to amplify it as well. This was followed in 1916 by Ernest Anderson's tuned radio frequency, TRF receiver. Has anybody here ever played with a TRF receiver of that vintage? I don't see anybody there, but basically, think of it as a whole bunch of amplified RF stages. So you go through and tune one knob, then the next knob, then the next knob, and of course that one. By the time you got to the third knob, the first one needed to be readjusted, and so you went back and peaked all these controls until you finally got the signal to come in. But there was no mixing of anything, so it was straight frequency in, frequency out, detected, and then into audio. So once again, not extremely sensitive, not extremely selective. As a matter of fact, here's an article that I ran into in the January 1916 QST magazine, and really talked about the what happened with a typical ham radio conversation of the day. And I'm just going to read this real quickly and think about being in his shoes. This was written, by the way, by the Old Man. Of course, we all know who the Old Man is. His pen name in QST was literally the Old Man. It says the program, which usually happens when two amateurs want to reach each other, is following. A hears from X that the latter gets B loud every night. A has never heard B and wonders how it is that X gets him when they're approximately the same distance away. A tunes up and tests and calls B and makes a nuisance of himself all over the state, but fails utterly to communicate with B. He then sits down and writes B a letter. B answers in a few days to the effect that he wasn't at his instruments that evening. He then tells about some wonderful record he has made with the station anywhere from 2 to 10 times as far away as A. Then A decides he will do the right thing this time, so he writes back to B and says how pleased he was to hear from him and suggests they make a definite test the following Wednesday night at 9:15 sharp. Wednesday night at 9:15 comes around and A opens up exactly on the second. He has arranged to send the first 2.5 minutes and then listen the next 2.5 minutes for B. They were to alternate back and forth in this fashion until they got each other. Didn't that sound kind of like FT8? A begins and sends carefully until exactly 9:17:30 and 30 seconds. Then he throws his aerial switch and begins to tune. He hears very distinctly a little boy on the next block with a spark coil and a few dry cells stumbling through. How do I sound? Right, and then eventually he waits for the young man to finish his, and then he tries to get a hold of the guy, and of course he never does. So this is how hard it was even to get a signal across the state, let alone across the country. And really the frustration that there was in trying to get the early communications going with the very early types of equipment that they were using. Oops, hold on a second here. Trying to get it to the next slide here. Uh-oh. Oh, hold on. My computer will not advance it to the next slide. I can do it manually. Finally, in 1916, Armstrong develops the super regenerative receiver, and then finally, 1920, patented the super heterodyne, which was really state of the art then, right, and still is today. And of course, the purpose of a super heterodyne is it mixes the signal down from a fairly high frequency down to a much lower frequency. Typically in AM radios, it's at 455 kilohertz. Instead of dealing with megahertz, they're dealing with kilohertz. It's a lot easier for the tubes to amplify that. It's a lot easier to build tune circuits that will not be terribly inefficient. So, and of course, if you buy an AM radio today, unless it's an SDR radio, they all are exactly that same technology. Finally, in January of 1920, things are starting to get back after World War I. Of course, we lost amateur radio during World War I. They completely lost the licenses. They had to start all over again. And so the quest again was to try to get a signal to get all the way across the country. It's interesting that in January of 1920, they talked about the first time they were actually able to get a signal most of the way across. It said this is splendid. It gives us that feeling of exultation that comes only with the joy of achievement and seems in its deeper aspect particularly in the motion of the radio amateur. It talks about from the remarkable ease from which we these same distances and greater are covered nearly every night, perhaps not regularly across the whole face of the country. We will not be surprised when the day arrives when you're able to span the continent nightly, but with one intermediate station. Not get a signal all the way across the country, but only have one station in the middle to get a signal all the way across the country. That was the goal of amateur radio and the DXers back in January of 1920. As a matter of fact, in April of 1920, QST showed on the front of their magazine cover here where they could take 5 stations and get a signal all the way up to Alaska. It would take 5 intermediate stations to do that. So sometimes you imagine how long it would take a message to get from the Atlantic region up to Alaska. It could take days, or even could take much longer than that, depending on trying to find somebody who was at their radio, trying to get everything coordinated and set. And you think about the early days of the ARRL, it really was the amateur radio relay, the American Radio Relay League, right? ARRL back then. As time marches on now, this is August 1920, QST in the stray section. They talked about really the first one-way communication where somebody in had heard a station in Honolulu, Hawaii was heard in California using an 8-stage amplifier. So basically, it was a TRF radio with 8 stages to it in order to get the amplification required to get a signal over there. And they talked about now for some Atlantic coast station to get through to the Azores about the same distance. So they're still trying to figure out a way to conquer the Atlantic Ocean and get communications across the ocean. And if you read in April of 1921, they're getting closer. They talk about 6EA in Los Angeles heard by, this is not two-way communications, this is one-way communications. So station 6EA in Los Angeles heard by K2F in New Jersey, 6ER in Los Angeles heard by 8ZY in Ohio, and 6GO. Oh, 6GO, is that you, by the way, Gail? Probably not, but anyway, out of Oakland, heard by 2KF in New Jersey. So once again, these are if you the best way to get your name into QST was at that time was to have talked to somebody that was on the other side of the country or as close as you could get. That was actually worthy of publication back then. In November 23rd, 1921, they had the first transcontinental signal report at any power level, and at just 50 watts, and using this newfangled technology called continuous wave, or CW. And the article here in January 1922, QST says, we believe establishes 2 new records. First, as far as we know, it's the first time that a 6th district station, California, has been heard in the 1st district. Second, it represents a new miles per watt record for the ever-increasing CW. Is the first time that the continent has ever been spanned by such a low power. And then our belief is the maximum distance that 50 watts of CW on 200 meters is ever covered, at least over land. So this was a record that was being set to get a communication all the way across the country. And it wasn't Spark, it was this newfangled thing called CW. So the next frontier now was to try to get a signal across the ocean, right? Get it across the pond. Thoughts about this started well before the World War I, and also the Radio Club of America, which was another radio club similar to the ARRL back then. We're both trying to figure out a way to get this done. In 1919, after amateurs were back on the air of World War I, a guy by the name of Sleeper, who was the editor of Everyday Engineering magazine, it was originally Everyday Mechanics, became Everyday Engineering, came up with a system where they were going to have a contest. And they're going to he rounded up a bunch of prize sponsors and figure out a way to get this done was to offer a reward essentially for the first person to get a transatlantic communication. I found this kind of interesting when I did the research for this. If Everyday Mechanics magazine, it says here how to build a transatlantic wireless receiving set. And then it says it fits in your pocket. And I was trying to figure out how they would do that in 1921 to have a receiver fit in your pocket. And that certainly would not fit in any of my pockets. It turns out that one of the things about Everyday Mechanics and later Everyday Engineering magazine is it was small enough the magazine itself could fit into your pocket. So it took me a while to figure that one out. But that certainly would not, I don't think, fit in anybody's pocket. They decided they were going to have the official challenge was published in the September 1920 issue of Everyday Engineering magazine. They talked about the who can enter. You had to qualify for it. You had to tell them what your station was, how you were going to do it, and they talked about some of the prizes that were in there. They had to register. They were going to publish a list in the December issue of who had qualified to try to win the award. However, unfortunately, November was the magazine's last issue. They essentially went bankrupt before they could actually get the contest over. Sleeper himself contacted Hiram Maxim, 1AW, to ensure the challenge went through anyway. And so it really fell into the bailiwick of the ARRL to help make sure that this went through. When they went out of business, the ARRL worked with the RSGB, the Radio Society of Great Britain, and they attempted the first one-way DX contest. And this was done through a series of transatlantic tests. You guys, I'm sure, have read the articles that we had in QST. We actually had a simulated transatlantic test here, I think, a couple of years ago between U.S. hams on the Atlantic seaboards, the Atlantic and England. And an interesting thing in QST magazine here, it says, it is hoped that during the coming winter, the next transatlantic contest will be recorded. That is transmission from a 200-meter, 1 kilowatt experimental station will basically set a new standard. And it says that his name will never be forgotten as long as there are radio experimenters. How many people here know who the first person to win this award was? Well, gee, I guess I'm sure his name was forgotten, but we're going to find out who the first two-way guy was, at least. So the bottom line is they held these transatlantic tests. They set up schedules with numerous stations in England, numerous stations in the U.S., and guess what? Not one U.S. station was heard in England. Period. End of statement. That was the end. It was a complete failure. And of course, the first thing when you have a failure like that is you try to find out who you're going to blame. Well, in the May 1921 issue of QST, they decided to publish about here. It says such reception is a new field for British experimenters, and they hardly can be expected to show the same performance as an American dyed-in-the-world ham who has learned to get his amateur DX only after years of patient struggle. We have tested most of the circuits used by the Britishers and find them to be decidedly inferior to the standard American regenerative circuit using barometer tuning in secondary and tertiary circuits. In other words, the Brits just couldn't build a good radio. And of course, we had Armstrong and they didn't. And that was probably something that made a huge difference. But they basically said, hey, the Brits weren't up to the muster that they had in the US. We would bet our new spring hat that if a good U.S. amateur with such a set as an Armstrong Super could be sent to England, reception of U.S. amateurs would be straight away. And of course, they reproduced this in the English wireless world, which was the RSGB magazine, and caused considerable commotion among the British, as one might expect. They weren't terribly happy with that. That it was their fault that it was that the signal did not get through. So they tried again in late 1921, and this time they really had the first DXpedition. They sent Paul Godley 2ZE to Scotland with a brand new Armstrong super heterodyne receiver and a super regenerative receiver. And he met a guy on the boat on the way over to England named Harold Beveridge. If you guys have ever heard of the Beveridge antenna, I've got one here just running along the length of my property. He said, hey, you're going to go do these tests and try to get a signal sent back to the U.S. I've got the perfect antenna for you. And so they ended up building a couple of 1,300-foot long Beveridge antennas in Scotland. And really, this was the first DXpedition I think ever was sending a U.S. ham to England to try to get the job done. Paul Godley was such a popular ham and well-known ham here that he was actually had an endorsement for these AP Atlantic Pacific radio tubes, and it says ARRL is sending Paul Godley of Montclair, New Jersey, to England to receive messages from American Amateur, and he's chosen AP tubes exclusively for this purpose. Use the tube that Paul uses, use the tube the Navy uses, right? So he had a product endorsement from a tube manufacturer. That's how big of a ham he was. So they finally had in December of 1921, they had the next round of transatlantic tests, and they finally did have success, and they had quite a few stations that were worked. However, one thing you can notice the number of stations using Spark and the number of stations using this newfangled CW technology, right? And the reason, as I mentioned, Spark signals are very broadband, they're damp wave, they're extremely broad, and CW is much narrower, maybe 150, 200 hertz. It may be a bit a little wider back then, but so a lot more of the stations using this newfangled CW got through than they did on Spark. But of course, like in anything else, right, there are the diehard guys that didn't like CW, and CW was going to be the end of amateur radio as we know it. Does that sound familiar? And by God, it's going to be Spark forever, as 9CS here proudly states on his QSL card. But now, how about a two-way contact, right? We've got a one-way contact. Godley had heard several, actually quite a few stations from the U.S. in Scotland. How about a two-way contact? Well, enter a guy by the name of Leon Deloy, and we're going to talk about Mr. Deloy here as we go on. So who was Leon Deloy? Well, he was a pretty well-known ham in France, probably the number one amateur in France. And to quote a passage from out of the book 200 Meters and Down, he said, he lived, thought, acted, and worked with one objective: to work across the Atlantic. He really wanted to be the first one to get his signal heard across the Atlantic Ocean. He had, as a matter of fact, he had written a letter on September 22nd, 1920 to Mr. Sleeper at Everyday Engineering Magazine saying, hey, I got these nice radios, I got a nice equipment, I've got everything it takes to get it done. I know I'm not in England, but gee, can I be part of this anyway? I can probably get it done for you. And of course, the Brits got a hold of that, and of course, the Brits and the French don't exactly see eye to eye in a lot of things, in a lot of ways. And the RSGB turned him down pretty straightforwardly. So the first transatlantic test failed, and but he was there. He wanted to be part of it. It might have happened. It might have taken place had he been there, but it didn't. But Deloy did not give up. In 1922, he actually got on a boat, came across the Atlantic over to the United States, took a train to Chicago, and attended the second ARRL National Convention held in Chicago. And then after the convention was over, he talked to a lot of hams that were there. He went and visited some of the what we'd call super stations on the East Coast to find out what they were using for radios, what they were using for equipment. That's like that we like going visiting K3LR or W3LPL today. He was looking and visited those hams to find out what they were doing, to find out how he could be successful. When it was all said and done, he bought a new Armstrong super heterodyne receiver, packed it under his arm, just like he would an ICOM 7610 or something, right? And headed back to France and to get ready for the next transatlantic test. The fourth transatlantic test in 1923, the first two-way transatlantic communications were finally accomplished by Deloy, who was in Nice, France, and also communicating with the ARRL's traffic manager, a guy by the name of Fred Schnell, using the call 1MO. And they were using the higher 110 meter, about 2.72 megahertz frequencies, and using those better receivers. And they finally got a signal, two-way signal, using CW across the Atlantic, first time ever. And it was really kind of controversial because Schnell being an ARRL sponsored contest, and it turns out that ARRL traffic manager won the contest. You can imagine there was some controversy there. Thank God there wasn't a My ARRL voice on Facebook when this took place. There would have been a lot of of activity on social media back then. But he did win an official Brown Derby for his efforts, and that Brown Derby, by the way, is still at ARRL headquarters in Newington. I haven't seen it, but I'm gonna have to have someday I'll have to have Mr. Minster dig it out of the archives and bring it to a board meeting so I can see it. But he did win it. He did win an official Brown Derby. Here's the first QSL cards that were generated. F8 F8 or 1MO working F8AB, and F8AB worked not only A1MO, America 1 was what the A stood for back then. He also worked 1XW, who was John Reinhardt. And you guys that are familiar with the history of radio, John Reinhardt was another figure that came in a few years later, but he was an early ham back then. He was the second person to work across the Atlantic, and they both did it on the same evening. Schnell was first, and Reinhardt was second, and he sent them both the same QSL card. And just to show you the type of equipment that they used to accomplish this, this was 1MO's transmitting station, very primitive, giant batteries and a couple of tubes and an oscillator. Deloy, on the other hand, there's his TRF receiver. And I show this picture just to if you can see how kind of crude this looks. Well, this is what they did back then, and certainly shacks look a lot neater. I every time my wife gets mad at me about how bad my shack looks, I just say, look, it could be worse. Look how it used to be back in the old days. That was a pretty state-of-the-art shack back then. And then finally, so the things are starting to progress. In January 1924, ARRL starts predicting the future, that by 1930, international communications would become common. See this guy, pinning maps or pinning pins on a globe, and all these, QSL cards from all over the country, all over the world, are hanging up on his wall. So they're predicting that that amateur radio would certainly, international communication would be commonplace, and that's exactly what happened, as we all know. They accurately predicted the future. Now let's talk a little bit about the early DX awards. By the late 1920s, DX contacts were becoming very commonplace. Solar Cycle 16 was in full bloom, and that certainly helped things a lot. In 1926, a guy by the name of Brandon Wentworth with the call 60I, he was the first person to have confirmation of having worked all 6 continents as defined by the IARU. And by the way, the IARU was founded just, I think, a year earlier by Maxim, as kind of, as we know, is the international organization for amateur radio. 4 years later, the IARU generated what's really the first DX award, was the Worked All Continents Award, and he was the first recipient of it. And here's how the original continental distribution was, and these are pretty much still the same continents that we have today for the Worked All Continents Award. In November of 1934, a magazine called R9 that later became Radio News and eventually became the magazine we all knew, as they say, know as CQ, but as you know, CQ has just recently ceased publications. They had decided to first they had divided the world into continents. Now they started dividing up further into zones, right, to make things a little bit easier, but a little more goal searching for people that needed the awards. So they divided the world into 40 zones, and they became known as the R9 DX zones of the world. Later, the CQ zones that we all use in all the CQ contests. Here's the original R9 DX zones, what we call the CQ zones now, and you can see it's pretty much still the same today. The U.S. is divided into Zone 3, 4, and 5. Alaska Zone 1. Zone 2 is up in the Newfoundland area. Greenland is in 40. Europe's in 14. Central or Eastern Europe is 15, and pretty much it's exactly the same as it is today, basically almost 100 years later. And now let's talk a little bit about the DXCC program. People were starting to work a lot of different countries. They decided to figure out how are we going to decide what a country is. And an article that Clinton DeSoto wrote in October of 1935, he wrote an article called "How to Count Countries Worked." There was no award program at that time for individual countries other than the worked all zone, but they were starting to work towards the DXCC program. They had started thinking about it about 1932, and they had put it off, put it off, put it off. There was a lot of arguing that went on among the DX men as to what a country was, and they finally had to do something. And this document that Clinton DeSoto wrote really was they established one rule, and that was first rule was to define what an entity is. And an entity was defined as each discrete geographical or political entity is considered to be a country. So Hawaii could be a country, Alaska could be a country, Panama could be a country. And that was really the first time that this thing was described. So when you work DXCC, you really haven't worked 100 countries, you've worked 100 entities. And as far as ARRL is concerned, an entity is a country. That's just a little phraseology there. However, it also states that what was defined as an entity was still open to interpretation by every amateur DXer. That was, they could argue among themselves whether it was really an entity or not. The ARRL really didn't want to get embroiled in that, but eventually they had to do it. In 1937, in August 1937, they said, there came a time, though, when fate caught up with us and we could no longer elude the problem. They finally had to come up with a first list of DXCC countries. And it does say that, oh, by the way, that, this is, we present you not an official list of countries, since a official presumes general sanction, and that only comes with time. But we feel it is just about as complete as can be made, fair to the DX man from a standpoint of giving credit where credit is due. In other words, well, here it is, guys. Use it if you want, but it's going to be up to you guys to decide among yourselves what you want to call a country. And finally, in September 1937, they announced the original DXCC, the Century Club, where you could turn in 100 cards and become part of this club, the DX Century Club. You could also get your name listed in QST. As a matter of fact, you could get your name listed in QST if you had 75 or more. So they actually had a ladder program where they would show in there how many people had got DXCC each month and how many people were getting close to getting DXCC each month. The first 5 hams to reach DXCC were published in November of 1937. And here they are right here. The first one was Frank Lucas, that had 112 different countries, Douglas Borden, 105, and et cetera. And those listed with 75 are also getting there. So now I got a question for you guys. And think about the state of the art in 1937, right? Here's a 1937 Helicrafters SX9 Super Skyrider. I've actually got one of these radios in my shack. And there wasn't a lot of commercial transmitters available back then. If you had a lot of money, you could buy the Lafayette TB46. And then add on, you could buy it with a CW transmitter, or add an AM modulator to it and operate on AM. But basically back then, most transmitters that ham were using were pretty homebrew, still pretty crude. And that's just the way it was. This was pre-World War II. Of course, it changed a lot after World War II when war surplus became available. Some DXCC milestones, and I'm gonna ask the audience some questions here and see if anybody can answer any of these. Remember, the first 5 DXCC members were published in QST in November of 1937. How many DXCC members do you think there were by March of 1938, 4 months later? Anybody want to take a guess? I don't hear anything, but I'll just have to tell you then. But the answer is 15. So in 4 months, there were only 15 new members of the DXCC Century Club. How many by November of 1938, a full year after they had announced the program? The answer, you can guess in your mind, but the answer is 69. So not even 100 in a year. When was the first list of the first 100 DXCC members published? In other words, how long did it take them to get 100 members of the DXCC program? How about February 1939, right? World War II had already started. It took that long. The US hadn't gotten World War II yet, but in Europe, World War II was going. And it took till February of 1939 for there to be 100 hams who had confirmation of having worked 100 countries. And here's an interesting question, too. In November of 1939, there were 186 DXCC members. How many of those were phone DXCC? Does anybody want to guess? The answer is one. One phone DXCC in November of 1939, and 185 CW. So phone was still, the CW was still the way to do it. Phone was terribly inefficient. This was before single sideband, so it was AM. It was a lot harder to get through on phone than it was on CW. I just thought that was interesting. So let's talk a little bit about the modern DXCC program. The DXCC program was suspended along with all amateur station licenses in 1941. They were during World War I. They had completely stopped amateur radio. They voided all licenses. They became null and void. During World War II, they got smarter and they realized that they needed to have amateurs to join the Signal Corps, and needed to have licensed amateurs meant they already had been trained. So they did not suspend licenses, but you could have an operator license, but you could not have a station license. So they stopped issuing station licenses, but you could still get an operator license. So they suspended the DXCC program in 1941. However, good news, when the war was over, hams got back on the air officially on November 15th, 1945, so they could start working DX again. However, the bad news is we only got initially 10 meters, 6 meters, 2 meters, in the 2 gigahertz band. Think of what 2 gigahertz technology was like in 1945. It's not, probably wasn't a lot of activity there, but that's all we got originally. Eventually, we got the last band, by the way. Does anybody know the last band we got back out of the ham bands that we had? The answer is 80 meters. And the reason for that was was being used for ship-to-ship communications and ship-to-shore during World War II pretty extensively. That was the last ham band that we got back. So the bad news is they decided that they're going to have a brand new DXCC program. A lot of countries had shifted. Countries went away. New countries were formed. And they decided to come up with a new program, new DXCC certificates and QSOs. And any QSOs you had before November 15th, 1945 didn't count. So I'm not sure exactly 100% why they did this, other than the fact the decision was made. I'm sure there was a lot of controversy. The guys that had DXCC now had to start all over again. The DXCC program itself came back to life in June of 1946, but they really did not release a new country list until February 1947. And here's the list that came out in the February 1947, and it says, and as one would expect, once again, the ARRL really didn't want to make not make friends with the DXCC guys, so they talk about the countries list here. It says naturally there will be some difference of opinion by some of the DX men, and the collaborators will be pleased to entertain any criticisms. In the meantime, it becomes your yardstick in the ARRL DX contests and DXCC. In other words, here's what we recommend, but hey, you guys are the DXers. You go figure it out, but here's what we recommend. So let's talk about a little bit. We're going to wrap things up here. DXing today, well, certainly a lot easier than it was in 1921. I think we can all agree that. Many work DXCC in a weekend during contests. I can't tell you how many times I've gotten, over 100 countries on 15 meters or 20 meters in a contest. It's pretty darn easy to do. I think I've gotten as many as 130 in a weekend in a contest. And just imagine that versus what it was in, where it took years for somebody to get their first 100 country. Of course, the FT8 mode is controversial. Is it really not ham radio? Well, I think it is. It's certainly the same way that people were thinking about CW and Spark, right? It's going to be Spark forever. Well, you got CW comes along, FT8 comes along now, and it's kind of supplanting the CW in a way. There's many de-expeditions on the air. Some are small, some are large, right? So there's guys that go to islands and sit on a deck, sipping their margaritas. And there's guys that go do things like go to Bouvet, right, and have to wear survival suits to even get on the island, and some risking their lives to do it. There are big giant de-expeditions, right? This is one of the ones down to, I believe it's one of the South Orkneys down in the Antarctic. Here's guys basically wearing what look like almost like spacesuits, right, to keep from freezing to death. And there's the guy that sets up with his sippy margaritas on a nice Caribbean at a hotel in the Caribbean. So the resort hotels not so much, but the big de-expeditions certainly cost a lot of money. They're expensive. And of course, the rarer they are, the harder they are to get to. So really, I'm going to leave you guys with this thought about who has it easier, or who has it easier. Do you think it's the DXer, or maybe it's the DX, right? So when you work these guys, know what it takes to work DX. Of course, this is Bob Valio, W6RGG. Who I replaced as ARRL second vice president, sitting on Scarborough Reef. And just imagine what it took to do that, versus the guy sitting in his shack and his wife's bringing him the nice beer. You do that, right, Gail? You do that for Mike? No? Okay, just thought I'd ask. And who had it easier? The ham in 1924 or the ham in 2024? Right? I think achieving DXCC is certainly a lot easier now than it was back then, and really appreciate what we have now and how difficult it was back in the early days of amateur radio. If you haven't read the book by Clinton DeSoto called 200 Meters and Down, I actually did this presentation and then read the book. And everything that I researched in early editions of QST, which is really where I got this information, was pouring through literally 10 or almost 100 different issues of QST from 1915 all the way up until World War II to get the research for this presentation I've done tonight. And it's really condensed down by Clinton DeSoto in the book 200 Meters and Down. I don't think the ARRL sells this anymore, but it's really a great read. I wish I'd read this before I went through all the trouble of researching QST magazines. It would have been a lot easier, but I did this while I was having hip surgery done and had a long recovery. So I sat down and started going through the archives on the ARRL website. And with that, I want to say thank you. I'll turn it back to you guys, and I really appreciate you guys listening to me tonight. And I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing now and wonder if there's any questions. Okay, any questions? And Gail, I didn't mean to give you a hard time, but you're the one I can see in the screen.
Good speech.
Okay, I'll turn
it.
Steve, go ahead.
Oh, nothing. I just said great speech. I really enjoyed that. A lot of it. Thank you.
Thank you, guys. Well, like I said, it's amateur radio history is one of my passions. What you can't see is, I guess it's the other direction. I've got another room full of old radios in the my vintage shack on the other side, and I also have a presentation I did you guys may have heard of called The History of the Ham Radio Call Sign, that traces the history of call signs back to before there were call signs. I did that one for PacificCon a few years ago, and I that ended up going up on YouTube, and it's got over 85,000 views right now. And I figured if people were going to be that thrilled about call signs, that something about early DX history might be good too. And I'll be doing this presentation also at the Pacific Northwest DX convention here in August. So I hit the Southern California guys, and now I'll hit the Northern California guy, or the Northern guys up in the Washington and Oregon. Any questions?
Mike, this is Rob, WA3IHV. That was a great talk. We enjoyed it. I wanted to just shift motion here for a little bit. In your role as second Vice President of the ARRL. Do you have any insight about LOTW and the computer issues?
Yes, I know all about it, and I can tell you a little bit about it. You may have heard, I'm sure you guys have heard a lot. LOTW came back up online last night, and it is up again, but it's also I was able to get in and log into it last night. However, 10,000 other people were doing it at the same time. And once I got in, I got booted back out again when I tried to get around and got a 404 error or something like that. It is back up again. Minster has been giving us weekly updates to the board. Some things we can say that because there's lawyers involved and law enforcement involved, you guys know that this was a cyber attack. There are potential legal implications involved. They're really, not letting us say much more other than what's been released publicly. But I can say that that LOTW was brought up, I believe it was yesterday, and I would wait a week or two to let it settle down. There's probably, think of how many people operated WPXCW, probably 6,000, and then how many people operated Field Day? Probably 10,000, and all those logs are going to be uploaded to Logbook of the World. And there's always the guys that look at their LOTW every time they work one. They'll go and look and see when it's when it's getting confirmed on LOTW. I would ask you guys please to let it settle down for a while before you go on there. I think as time goes on, it'll get more back to normal. But it was up and running. I was able to log into it under both my normal call sign and my contest call sign, which is WM7A. So it is back up again, despite all the pundits thinking that it was gone forever. And Minster had reported to the board last Thursday that he was able to get into it before they publicly turned it back on, and all his data was there. And once he was confirmed that all his countries were there and everything was there, and other people at headquarters, that's when they flipped the switch. And everybody, as far as I have heard, have noted that the people that have been able to get in have indicated that everything is still there. Essentially, once it dies down, it'll be completely back to normal again. Does that answer your question?
Okay, as of can you hear me okay, Mike?
Yeah, I can hear you.
As of 7 a.m. this morning, the LOTW status monitor indicated that it was still down. So there's a disconnect between, because that's what I've been checking since this whole thing began. But if you look now, you'll see it shows it being down.
Okay, that's possible. They may have turned it off for some reason, but as of last night, it was up because I was able to log into it. Several other people were able to log into it. People are actually able to get logs uploaded. And then I think what happened is so many people got on it. They may have done something. I haven't heard anything since then from what's going on at headquarters. But I said, as all I can tell you is, as of last night, I was able to get in and log into it. But once I got in, I wasn't able to do much.
Mike, how did you determine, or how were you notified that it was back up? Did the error?
Oh, where else? I heard it on Facebook. I read it on Facebook. Maybe they turned it back on by accident. I don't know. I haven't heard anything official. I know as much about it as you guys. I went on Facebook and somebody said, "Hey, it's up," and of course nobody believed it. And somebody went on and said, "Yeah, I know. Hey, it's up too." And next thing you know, there's hundreds of people on. There's probably thousands of people on, and maybe it crashed again. I don't know. So all I can tell you was working. It was up last night. If it's down again, I don't know. We're supposed to have another board meeting to discuss where they are with it, but I have not heard anything officially.
Question?
I know as much as you guys do about that.
Have a question? Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you.
Okay. Back to the presentation question. Who had it easier somebody using international mail in 1924 or somebody using LTW in 2024?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly 2024. But you know, I kind of say this to people that are anti-FT8, right? That it's too easy. It's not real ham radio. Back in the old days, you know, I used to have to, you know, I had to learn code and I had to do all this thing. And I, you know, I took my extra test like a lot of people did in San Francisco on the fourth floor of the 444 Battery Street with jackhammers going off in the, you know, down on the at the floor level with the back windows open while you're trying to take a CW test. And you know, but technology has changed, things have changed, and you got to kind of go with the flow.
I was just curious that they had so many all of a sudden jumped in a month or two to the hundreds, and they all had to do it by postal service. So it's just amazing.
Well, and think of how it was even to get the contacts, right? When Maxim talks about how they had to set up a schedule, you know, via mail in order just to work somebody. And then if you're lucky, you could hear them. Certainly a lot easier today.
Anybody else?
Okay, this is not a legitimate question. It's a compliment to how wonderful it was to work with you for the ARRL Foundation and for giving scholarships to young people. So thank you, Mike.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, what you guys don't know is actually got booted off the foundation when I became ARRL vice president because the foundation is run by ARRL directors. And once I was no longer a director, I became a helper along with Gail. And I had a great time working with her on the ARDC, the high dollar scholarships. And we interviewed a whole bunch of candidates. And I can tell you that the future of amateur radio is bright. We interviewed some extremely bright, active amateur radio kids. And, you know, every year I do this. I did that for 6 years. I was on the ARRL Foundation board. And I can tell you it's really the most exciting thing that one can do in amateur radio because you're essentially interviewing the future. And, you know, we're all going to be replaced by somebody. And there are some great kids that are going to be taking our place in the future in amateur radio. I think Gail can attest to that. I think you had your microphone turned off.
Yeah, it's only got it's 0 bars. It'll stay on for a minute. Can you guys hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. We have a new application. We have Jim Wellington, K6SMT, who has been here a number of times and has applied to become a member of the DX Club. Jim, do you want to say anything?
We can do that.
We take Bitcoin.
Take cash? Or does that make you look like a drug dealer?
There's the treasurer right there.
All right, I'm Jim Wellington, K6SMT. And I've been a ham radio operator since 1960. I was 14 years old and started off as technician, worked my way up to conditional because I didn't have a driver's license. I lived in Erie, Pennsylvania, near Seps.
We lost the microphone again.
Should use CW.
Or Spark.
Yeah.
While they're doing that, Lou, I just want to say hi to you. When I lived in California before I moved to Oregon, I used to be KW6T.
Yeah, I noticed that earlier.
That was a great call sign. You must have got your, I think that was in 1983 that I got that call. You must have got your extra right around that same time.
Yes, I did. We may have to talk among ourselves.
Okay, so did you hear any of that or not?
Nothing.
Can,
It was talking about being licensed in 1960, and that's where it ended.
all right.
Test 1, 2. Anything?
Yeah.
All right. So I was 14 years old, 1960, started off as a technician in Erie, Pennsylvania on 6 meters. I kind of tired of that after about a year or two and got a conditional license because I couldn't drive to Buffalo, New York, which was the nearest FCC station. And finally, in about 1970 or so, the FCC came to Erie and I got an advanced license. I got the 3 most unlikely licenses to start with than anybody I know. Then I graduated from Penn State, and then life got in the way, you know, wife and mortgages and kids and stuff like that. And so in March of this year, well, I've lived in California and San Diego for 12 years. I got started, took me about a year to figure out how to get an antenna up with my homeowners association. So I got a 60-foot dipole in my attic and a 59-foot long run. So the 2 ends are drooping down 5 feet on either end. And just trying to figure out, things have changed in the last 60 years or so since I was on last, to say the least. So I've been doing baby steps, trying to figure out what I'm doing and how this newfangled software-defined radio actually works and all the options on it. And then figure out how to do all the software, get on the LOTW, and then it kind of died. And amazingly enough, after 6 weeks of not even being on the air, I tried last night and got into LOTW, and then it wouldn't let me do anything. I just, by luck, started that. Anyhow, recently, so I've got 23 contacts in 16 countries. So the dipole in the attic does get out. Okay. Who's next?
I have a technical question. Am I there?
I'm hearing you.
Oh, okay. What did England call tubes?
Valves.
Right.
Okay, so we have Jim's application on the table here. I guess we take a vote. All in favor? Anybody opposed? Good. Well, welcome to the DX Club, Jim. We have another housekeeping item. We've worked on, the board has worked on updating the Constitution and bylaws, and we've gone around and around on a lot of the things, and from my standpoint, they're not really substantial changes. It's just kind of updating it to 2024 information, like talking about electronic signing on to the club meetings and things of that sort. And so we put it together side by side. We have the old and the new. The old is from, I think, 2009, and the new ones. And it goes to a vote of the board of the general membership. We need a 2/3 majority present at the meeting, but I think it's important enough that we'd like to try and get as many people as possible. We put it out on a Survey Monkey, and only, I think, 17 people out of, we have close to 80 people in the club have responded. So I recommend everybody at least respond one way or the other to let us know which way it's going. Otherwise, next month at the meeting, we'll just have a oral vote and see if we get 2/3 to pass it. It's, from my standpoint, it's not that substantial. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Pretty easy to vote.
Yes. The other thing is on the newsletter this this month, it cut off my last comment, which was the leadership, the members, the board, and the officers for the upcoming year. And that is, I'm president, Bud AE6BH is the vice president. Bob LaRose is the secretary. Brian Roberts is the secretary, is the treasurer. And then we have 3 board members: Jerry, W6KIN, Steve, K6RSH, and Lou, KQ6W, KW6Q. I knew
Easy
I'd
for you
screw
to
up.
say.
Yeah. 1 Alpha San Diego. Any other new business? Any old business? Well, let's go a quick round table, and Gail, it's up.
Gail, K6GO. I don't have anything great to report, but we did, as sick as we were, participated in field day, and we were up at Lake Poway, and we had many visitors, and we did a balloon launch thanks to Randy, who's not here tonight, but you all know what he does with the balloon launches, and that was very successful. And we had one city official was there, and in the balloon launch, we had students from UC San Diego and Mount Carmel High School. So we engaged some young people. We thought that was really good. And I just want to say, hey, Bob, it's really good to see you. And we're going to see Beth this weekend. And Steve's here from Australia. And look at this. This is wonderful. And again, Mike, good seeing you again.
Mike, NA6MB. We weren't sick at field day. We were recovering. We were trying to get our energy back. We were not contagious or anything, but we both came back from England, from Europe, with COVID. So that was a 13th, about 2 weeks ago. Anyway, I did take an HT with me to try and make some CEPT contacts on all the documentation required for that. I was able to bring up one repeater, I think, but the people that had been talking didn't respond. So I don't know if I had the right tone or whatever, but you know, an interesting experiment. But that's about it from here. We've been traveling and trying to get our energy back.
But here, AE6BH, not much to report. I'm really glad to hear LOTW is back, and looking forward to see what contacts have been confirmed in its absence. So that's something to look forward to in the coming weeks.
Hi, this is Tom K7YMG, just working FT8, but I did work FT8 for field day and got 256 contacts. So I lent those contacts to my club so that they could add to the score. And but otherwise helped set up the field day radio system. We we inherited a K3, and that was a lot of reading to figure out how to operate it. But finally figured that out. And strangely enough, all the audio is transformer coupled, so it was pretty easy to do. But anyway, that's about it.
Danny, WV6FWS. Really not much for the last month. So moving on to Brian.
Brian, KN6MJK, treasurer. Nothing to report. They haven't read in the bulletin.
Steve, K68 RSH. Anyway, I've been on 6 meters a lot, and I've had company from out of town the last month. It's just been not what I planned, but I even got, it's like fishing. The big fish always get away. I keep missing all the good contacts on all the most desirables. I'll get them. They're there for 1 minute, unable to do the QSO, boom, gone. And so I've been doing 6 meters too. I actually had England on 6 meters the other night. How long did I have it? Less than 1 minute. You know, it's like you just can't win, it seems like some days. But anyway, I crossed the DXCC line.
Yeah, Tom N6JOJ. I did go over field day for a while, but they got to 104 in Santee, and I said, I'm going home. So I did work one station from home on 520 up there up on Palomar. But other than that, I haven't been in a whole lot. Haven't been feeling all that good, but we made it here.
Jerry, W6KIN. I hadn't been into a field day in quite a while and actually operated, but I did get a chance this time. Went to Santee and worked CW for a while, and then went out to Point Loma in the evening and worked sideband and FM. So it's been a good one.
All right, Jim Wellington, K6SMT, your newest member of the club. And hope to see you off again.
Hi, I'm Mark, KI6IT. Many of you probably know that back in May, there was, if you were operating in the morning, you know that the radio bands all shut down and the propagation was lost. And what happened was it was the largest X-class solar flare in history. And so we've been measuring in my laboratory, trying to understand if we can figure out top to bottom what happened, because when you get the solar flares, you have a better protection against the galactic cosmic rays. And we measure the galactic cosmic ray products. And so from that, we can go backwards and see what the effect is on propagation. And so we're trying to do that right now by going back from the neutron physics, the cosmic rays, to what it means, why 7 megahertz shuts down so much quicker than other bands and recovers slower. And so it's a hard way to do it, but you know, all the easy stuff has been done.
KB6D, Michael, was at Poway Field Day. And so I've been going to Field Day for several decades, and I saw something I've never seen before. A gentleman came out and he brought a bunch of old radios and he had an old phonograph. Okay, fair enough. That's fine. He's got the phonograph set up right next to the station where the guys are operating. Guy puts a record on, he's playing Tchaikovsky or some classical music, he's got it cranked up, and the operator, instead of saying turn off the QRM, goes, I love Tchaikovsky, turn it up. So he operated the content, and I had to believe when he was giving the exchange, he's got Tchaikovsky booming in the background. A total head scratch, but I guess, to each their own. The guy had a spectacular collection of old radios and 78 records. He had these 78 records and playing Harry James and all sorts of stuff. So it was a very musical, festive field day at Lake Poway this year.
I missed out on that one, Michael, and I'm dying here. W0NI, Tom. I just handed out some contacts from home, stayed cool, and I am looking forward to LOTW coming back up again, as we all are. Steve?
Hi, I'm Steve, KE6FE, and most notable comment is after Eric gave his talk a couple of months ago at the meeting about 6 meters, I decided to get back on 6 meters, which I haven't been active in for probably 66 years. And it's quite a surprise. When I first started up in New York, if you worked New Jersey, it was real DX. Now, after doing it for a couple of months, I've got 30 countries worked, including, Argentina, England, Scotland, Portugal, blah, blah, blah. And it's exciting. It's nice to somehow, even after all these years, still find something that is new and gets the juices flowing.
Yeah, this is Bob W6ACU, and I agree that right now, especially in the day when things are pretty dead because absorption, 6 meters is the place to be, but I'll just comment on at night. Isn't it amazing from what we were doing a couple of years ago to have 15 meters open at night and sometimes 12 and 10? It's incredible what the solar cycle has done.
Okay, we'll go to the online people. Bob, go ahead. K9RHY.
Thank you, Bob, K9RHY. A couple comments. Great to see everyone. Mike, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. It was really enjoyable. Gail, we're certainly looking forward to having Beth say hello and Mike when she shows up there very shortly. Bob, I didn't mean to cut off the team in the newsletter. I thought your ending was really a greeting from that group of people, and I didn't see a need to reiterate it. So my apologies for doing that. It was quasi-intentional, I guess. Nothing else new from here. Again, welcome to our newest member, by the way, and good DX, everyone.
Thank you, Steve, VK3JA.
Yeah, hi, everybody. Steve outside of Melbourne. And last month on this club monthly meeting in the Zoom call, somebody mentioned that Jim Price was on his way to Croatia to operate 9A1A. Well, I actually soaked that up, and during the CWWPX contest, I worked 9A1A, and at the end of the exchange, I wrote, "Hi, Jim, ? And it comes back, Roger, Roger, hi, Steve." I'm still buzzing from this, everybody. Just imagine. I'm thinking from Jim's point of view, what's this like, because Jim has been in my shack, sitting in this chair, and he's working where he's been from Europe, and part of this club. It just gives me a buzz to think of how much fun this hobby is. It's just those little things of excitement that hit us from time to time like that. I'm still buzzing. So I'm sure the club's going to have Jim make a speech later on about what that trip was like. I'd really like to hear what it's like to operate 9A1A, and Jim's a good speaker. I'm sure he'll have a good story. So thanks for the invitation, Gail and Mike. Every month you remind me of this meeting, and I truly enjoy it. So thanks for letting me get in here. And hi, Danny, wherever you are in there too.
Thanks for joining us, Steve. Ron, WA6YOU.
Okay, thank you very much. And Ron out here in Fairfax, Virginia, where we're under severe thunderstorm watch. Field day was something else. We did Berkeley Park, operated 3 Alpha. It was 106 degrees out here, guys, with 90% humidity. And we did well, but it was just disgustingly hot. I didn't do much operating. I was mostly being the chef for all the meals that we served. Let's see, first time in 62 years as a ham, I finally got Alpha 51 confirmed on an actual paper QSL. And I wanted to say thank you to Mike, W7VO, outstanding presentation. I might get a hold of you to do something for our Vienna Wireless Society out here in Northern Virginia. And again, I want to say a big hello to my Navy brother back sitting next to you there, Rob, in the back, Danny, and good to see him again. So this is WA6YOU out in Fairfax, Virginia. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining. Lou, KW6Q.
Are you hearing me okay?
Loud and clear.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to be at the meeting tonight, but we've been traveling, and so I just couldn't get everything together. I did enjoy the presentation very much. Fortunately, I got here in time for that. I was in Colorado, and coming back, we were intending to stop in Ruidoso for field day, which I normally do. As it turns out, before we got there, the whole town was evacuated, and I'm sure you read it all about it in the paper. So, I understand several of my friends lost their homes. So, talk about heat. That's a lot worse than Fairfax, Virginia. Anyway, thanks very much. Nothing more.
Thanks, Lou. Ron, N6XT.
Thank you, Robert. Real nice presentation. Mike. I may be contacting you for some questions about some other stuff, probably. I worked field day. Unfortunately, I should have checked the guy. He supposedly knew how to set it up. I couldn't figure out why 20 was so dead. Started to work 3 contacts. That didn't work. I got frustrated. I walked away. I said, I'm done. He didn't have the right antenna port. I should have known to check him. He's a general. He's a veteran from a while back, but he just got back in the amateur radio. But live and learn. And I've been painting the walls with FT8. I've worked on 15 or 40. I've worked with a wire, fed wire and 50 watts at about 20 to 25 feet. I've worked a VK2. Let's see, as far as 4 and a couple in the United States. Japan calling me. I think there's a Europe calling me for a little bit. And I said, wow, 50 watts. Yes, it's an up and down cycle. Every once in a while I get on it. I send a few times. I said, nobody comes back. I send 3 times. Try a half a dozen stations. I jump out of it. I work Japan. I also work Cuba, Indonesia. This is 15. European Russia, Ireland, Kazakhstan. This is all in 3 days. And then China, Japan again, and one in the United States. And then also I was able to work Cambodia. That was the last one I worked. So that's it. And I want to upload LOTW, but I also connected and that rejected. Did the 404 and I figured out lots of people are on. So I'll wait a couple of weeks and then upload. Anyway, thanks for letting me join you guys. I had a little trouble with the link to hook it up. Thanks to, I think it was you, Robert. I got hooked up with that one. That was beautiful right away. So thanks for that. And we'll turn it back to you. Everyone have a good day and best DX.
Great. Thanks very much. Mike, do you want to have a final here? W7VO?
Yeah, right. Thank you. By the way, I did, while you guys were talking, I did try to log into Logbook of the World and I got a connection timeout error. So it tried to get in there. And so I don't know exactly what state it's in, but it, the link is there to try to get in. I tried to get in and although I got in last night, it was about 10 o'clock here, I think, when I did. And tonight I cannot get in. I got a connection timeout error. So I don't know if that's because there's too many people on that are doing it, but I haven't heard anything official. If I hear anything, I'll let you know, Robert. I think you're the one. See, who's the one that the vice president that I have the email address for?
86BH.
Yeah. If I hear anything, I'll let him know so he can relay it to you guys, or let Gail. I have Gail's email address too, and I'll find out. But like I said, I know as much as you guys do about it, and I apologize if it doesn't work. What the problem with getting that Logbook of the World up is that it connects to our association management software that has to do with, deciding whether or not you're an ARRL member. And one of the big problems with this whole attack was that everything, all the software systems at headquarters are intertied, and they're intertied together kind of like that. And you break one piece and it knocks the whole thing down. And so imagine you got 5 broken fingers and you're trying to fix all of them at the same time. And you don't know what affects what. And they've last time I heard, they were about 90% or so back to normal again. Logbook of the World, because it interacts with the association management software, was going to be the last thing that they were going to try to get back up again, because it was going to be the hardest to get up. Like I said, I was up last night. I apologize that it's not up tonight. At least like I said, I tried logging into it. I got a connection timeout error, just like you guys are seeing. But please be patient. It'll be back before you know it, and you'll just appreciate it all the more.
Great.
So 7-3s, thank you guys for the opportunity to come here tonight. I really enjoyed it. And if you guys or anybody's going to be up here in August, please consider attending the Pacific Northwest DX Convention up in Everett, Washington.
Thanks again. That was a great talk. And I just had one final comment. A lot of the World War II Navy radio operators in San Diego used to talk about the multiple hops from San Diego, how the Pacific, when it was smooth, would act as a reflector and they could get multiple hops out of that. Unfortunately, most of those operators are gone now, but I would have loved to talk to them about some of their experiences, because propagation is something that we still don't understand at all. So that was that was something that kind of tickled my fancy.
Well, imagine how it was in 1920s when it was all magic, right?
6 meters is still magic.
That's right. Anyway, thank you guys. I'm gonna cut off here and say thank you guys. All take care down there in San Diego, and Gail will be doing scholarships again before you know it.
Mike, can you end the recording?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I guess I have the ability to do that, don't I?
Yeah.
Okay. So let's.